Changes in technology are happening so fast, we sometimes fail to consider the implications of those changes. Today, what I'd like to offer you is 3 key ideas around the ethics behind how we handle data that can offer us maybe some insights into some of the changes that we're living through today. In 2015, after the earthquake in Nepal, a global relief effort was organized. Besides dollars, one of the key resources that was brought to bear was data. Data from governments, corporations, individuals, nonprofits, NGOs, was directed into resources like the Humanitarian Data Exchange and Ushahidi to map and direct aid. Likewise, in Liberia in 2014, during the Ebola epidemic, there was an effort made to try to use call detail records from mobile telephone providers to help to map and stem the spread of the disease. And while progress was made towards this goal, had it been able to be done faster and in real time, many lives would have been saved and a catastrophe averted. So what this brings up is the need for a framework of data governance. And what do I mean by data governance? A system of ethics that we start to use to think about this massive amount of data that we're starting to accumulate from all kinds of different sources. Now, we've heard about government data. Government data, we know that we are accumulating as taxpayers and we're contributing in that way. So we've asked the government data be opened. But what about corporate data? Things like social media and from private-public partnerships and from telephone companies. What about data from the emerging Internet of Things? Or data from individuals that they may be collecting with their own devices and have in their own data stores? Or other kinds of data from nonprofits and NGOs. And lastly, newly emergent kind of entities like data collaboratives that are actually correlating data from multiple data sets that we can start to use to bring to bear new insights on many of our toughest problems. So think for a moment also about some of the corporate data that's out there. Think what your life would be like if you weren't able to use tools like Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. You'd kind of be a second-class citizen. And in some ways, you're really compelled to use many of these modern services. So to the extent that you're using these services and you're being told that privacy is dead, you're really being told to contribute into these data sets without necessarily getting anything back. Now, what I'd like to show you is a couple of maps that I've made. This is a map that I made of St. Louis, Missouri. This is not a geographic map. This is a map of the Twitter users of St. Louis, Missouri. And what this shows, each dot represents a user, each line represents a follow relationship, and each color represents a community of shared relationships. And what you can see on this map is that there's tremendous segregation in St. Louis. In the lower left of the map, you see it's primarily young African Americans, and on the far right, you see it's primarily white, geeky people. And on the upper part of the map, you see it's mostly young white students. But what's interesting is the gap in the middle. There's no one in the middle connecting those two branches of the map, which suggests a tremendous amount of separation and divide in a city like St. Louis, which of course contributed to some of the things we saw in Ferguson. Here's a map of Istanbul that I made. And one of the key things that you can see here is, of course, different cohorts of people. But there's one group of people, young men, mostly frustrated young men, who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. And those folks are by far the largest cohort in Istanbul, and they stand at the opposite end from kind of the established business community, as well as religious and political tweets, and also sports acts as a connector between these communities. We can learn a tremendous amount about how a city like Istanbul works by looking at something like this. Now, we've also seen a variety of social media-driven revolutions and movements around the world over the last 5 years or so, whether we're talking about Tahrir Square or Gezi Park or Hong Kong, what have you. There's a feeling that to some extent these social media revolutions have fallen short of some of their goals. And I believe it's because people are trying to use social media as kind of a black box with the feeling that somehow or another, if they put the information out there, it will magically reach its intended recipients. I really don't think that's the case, and I think that one of the things we need to consider is the idea that if we're contributing to these data sets, we need to get access to them in some reasonable way. So I'd also like to talk quickly about encryption. We keep hearing about the debate around encryption. The fact of the matter is that strong encryption is a solved problem. There is no debate around encryption. What's at debate is the implementation. Now, we've heard just yesterday, in fact, that the FBI, in a tremendous act of overreach, has started to try to use the All Writs Act of 1789 to compel Apple to make a special version of iPhone software that would break all iPhone's encryption going forward. That's a really unacceptable solution to this problem, and I would propose that we need to start to push to get real strong encryption to be recognized by all governments as a fundamental human right. Thank you, thank you. Can we skip back to the last slide? There we go. I also want to just talk about anonymity for a second. We should remember that countries like the United States were founded using tools like anonymity. The Federalist Papers were published in 1787 under the name of Publius. Publius was actually Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay pushing to try to get the newly written US Constitution actually adopted. Had that not been available as a tool, it's unclear that the Constitution would have been adopted at that time. So we need to remember that tools like anonymity in today's world are equally legitimate tools, and we shouldn't be trying to figure out ways to crush anonymity. We should be trying to come up with ways to support it. So in conclusion, I believe that corporations have an ethical data to use private aggregated data for societal good and to protect it from those that would do harm. I believe that individuals have a right to access the data sets that we're creating together. I believe that we have a right to encryption, and I believe that we have a right to anonymity. So our task is to create a world that is both robust and just enough to not only survive, but to thrive when all of these rights and responsibilities are properly recognized. Thank you.